bank runs used to be analog,
Right.
and now they can happen back end digital, APIs. People can move money around a lot more quickly, and that changes the liquidity needs of banks. And I'm involved in Bitcoin venture. And the funny thing is, they were Bitcoin companies. I mean, a lot of their expenses are still in fiat currencies, even though they're operating in a Bitcoin environment. Some of their employees often might accept salaries in Bitcoin, but not all of them, and they have real world expenses that they're building on top of the incumbent system, so they have to connect with that incumbent system at least for a period of time. And the ironic thing was they were worried about their bank accounts. It's like the irony of Bitcoin companies worried about the stability of the dollar system, and how it can threaten their business. They're like, should I move to this bank? Should I stay in this bank? I mean, which banks are safe? I'm not sure. Because if you're running a business, you're often operating above certain FDIC limits. Now you're thinking about sweeping money into money markets when they're not in use, and it's like, should I do that? And what are so it's like they suddenly had to become plumbing experts in how the dollar system works because they didn't want to risk missing payroll for a multi-week period or something like that. And it's the irony of the situation. It's supposed to be that the fiat currency system's stable and that this is like this new frontier. And yet all these new frontier companies were like, yeah, I'm glad I have some Bitcoin on my balance sheet because, if I really need to make payroll and my bank's frozen or something, at least this is like a separate source I can turn to. And it just shows how messy the situation got in that time.
Lyn Alden highlights a concerning trend in the modern financial landscape. Bank runs, once analog phenomena, have now taken on a digital form, facilitated by APIs and rapid money movement. This shift poses liquidity challenges for banks and exposes the fragility of the fiat currency system. Alden notes the irony of Bitcoin companies worrying about the stability of the dollar system as they navigate complex banking relationships to ensure operational continuity. With 160 different currencies worldwide, each with its own monopoly, the lack of choice and porous borders amplify the need for alternative solutions like Bitcoin and stablecoins.
So in that world I mentioned where there's slow settlements and fast transactions and really thick middlemen, basically it all becomes a centralized financial stack. The result of this is that there are 160 different currencies in the world, and all of them have local monopolies over their own jurisdiction, and then most of them tie one way or another into the dollar system. They hold dollar assets, they have dollar liabilities, they can use that as the kind of their stabilization substrate. Um, but basically, there's these 160 different monopolies, and when you think of how they work, they are really not that different than arcades or casinos in the sense that they issue a token that really only has value in their monopoly. So when you go to an arcade, you get arcade tokens. It only has value in the arcade. If you try to take out the arcade token, it's useless. Um, and maybe the restaurant next door accept it because maybe they have a deal with the arcade, but a mile down the street, no one's going to accept it. Same thing's true for a casino. And basically, these fiat currencies operate in a similar way. That when you go to Egypt, the Egyptian pound has local value, but when you try to bring the Egyptian pound almost anywhere else, you're gonna quickly find that no one accepts it. It's even hard to convert it. It just loses like 90 some percent of its moneyness when it's anywhere outside of its monopoly jurisdiction. That's true for almost every currency in the world outside of the top five or so. Um, and most of them rapidly lose value. Um, and the people in there, their wages and their savings are denominated to a significant extent in that local currency. And so they're on this treadmill to kind of constantly keep up with that dilution that's happening. And capital controls are generally used to keep them in. That's how those currency monopolies are enforced. And it wasn't always like this. This is how the current system works. Um, and when you think about the two ways to get money in or out of a country, there's there's ports of entry, so airports. You can obviously only bring so much cash or gold through an airport. They're heavily restricted and surveilled. Or you can do wire transfers, bank transfers. But those are of course heavily surveilled, regulated. They can set artificial exchange rates. They can determine who in a country can get accounts in other currencies. So if you want to be in a country and you want a dollar account, they can dictate the rules of how that works or who can access them or how wealthy you have to be to access them. Um, if you're in one of those countries and you do have a dollar account, it's basically a levered bond fund with no backstop, right? They don't have a tie to the Fed. And so imagine Silicon Valley Bank, but there's no Fed there, right? So when you're holding dollars in a bank outside of the U.S., you better be pretty sure of the solvency and the liquidity of that bank because you're holding a fractional reserve dollar claim with no mechanism to enforce that really. And so you come to realization pretty quickly how unstable a lot of that system is. And essentially what things like Bitcoin and stablecoins do is they reintroduce choice to people. So instead of just having their local monopoly and only a couple ways to get in or out of it that are all tightly controlled, it kind of cracks open all those borders. So there's 40 currencies in Africa, there's 30 currencies in Latin America. Everybody has their own little, they're stuck in their own little monopoly, constantly getting debased. And what things like Bitcoin or stablecoins do is they say, if I'm doing work with a Nigerian graphic designer, right, they can, and they want payment. They can tell me what form of payment they want. They can hold up a QR code over a video call. They can send me a payment string with email or a DM and go around their local banking system and say, I want payment in stablecoins or I want payment in Bitcoin. And then it can just bypass their system. They can hold it, that they can transfer it. You can bring unlimited amounts through an airport, for example, by memorizing 12 words. Just all the porousness of those 160 currency borders becomes a lot bigger, a lot more porous, and it reintroduces choice of money. And of course, that comes with friction. Some countries tried their best to slow that down, but especially the worse their currency is, the faster people look for alternatives. And what stablecoins do is they say, okay, this is centralized, but the central hub is outside of that country. It's in another country. It's in the U.S. or it's in Italy or it's in country XYZ. It's outside of the country that's having the currency problem. And so people can choose to trust that. It's kind of like offshore bank account for the middle class instead of just the wealthy. Or you can have a almost completely decentralized version like Bitcoin that says there really is no central hub. It's this kind of interconnected swarm that exists, and it's this network that exists as long as the world has an internet, basically. And it's a decentralized monetary alternative. So I think that's the context to think of as these technologies come around, is that they kind of pierce open this currency monopoly situation that only exists because prior to Bitcoin, there was no such thing as fast global settlements. There's either no settlements at all, or you settle with physical gold, for example, which is, it took Germany years to repatriate their gold from the U.S. famously. And they were happy they finished ahead of schedule, and ahead of schedule was still years. Um, that's how large movements of value work in the modern era, and Bitcoin can settle global value in an hour. So it's a different technology.
Continuing, Lyn Alden discusses the historical patterns of debt cycles, highlighting two phases of resets. Initially, there's a shift from private to public sector debt, followed by challenges when public finances become overly indebted. Solutions may involve yield curve control or devaluing currency. Alden stresses the importance of owning real assets and managing debts wisely. With social media and portable capital, enforcing capital controls becomes harder.
Historically, in these long-term debt cycles, resets tend to occur with like a one-two punch. First, there's a big rotation from private sector debt to public sector debt. For example, the global financial crisis, the banking system kind of got reset. And the way that worked was, a lot of the debt was kind of pushed up to the sovereign level. And so that was like, I would call it punch one or phase one of the reset or the recapitalization, however you want to call it. The second phase is what happens when public finances are so indebted that their interest expense becomes problematic, and either that can resolve itself in one of different ways. For example, the 1940s, they used yield curve control. So we talked about the 2020s compared to the 1940s. The reason I make those comparisons is because that's generally when they went through those public sector resets, recapitalizations, different ways to describe it. And they can occur nominally. If you have external debts, you can just default on them. That's one option. Obviously, there's consequences for doing that. The other option is to default in real terms. So you print a bunch of currency, you hold rates below the inflation rate for a prolonged period of time, and people that were holding cash or bonds, they got a big haircut. They lost 30, 40, 50, 60, 70% of their purchasing power, maybe more in some cases, and they still get paid back nominally, but now nominal GDP is much higher relative to the debts that were just sharply devalued. And there's a couple different avenues to do that. They can do yield curve control. They could do gold recapitalization, for example. They can, there's ways to kind of recapitalize their sovereign balance sheets in a way that sharply devalues currency, either in a longer term time frame or in a non-linear time frame, like over the weekend. You can just do this big kind of decision that happened. And generally, defense against that from an investor standpoint is to own real assets and, if possible, to have debts denominated in the currency that are manageable. Long-term fixed rate mortgage or long-term corporate bond or something like that. You're shorting the currency, you're owning real assets. The challenge is that when countries do that, they also try to do capital controls or block the exits. They try to say, well, if we're going to devalue the currency, we're going to restrict this type of lending, for example. So we're going to make it harder to short the currency and borrow the currency. Or they say it's illegal to own this type of asset, which, is harder to do now than it was in the 1940s. Now we have social media. Now we have we're more connected. We're less unified than we were. So that it's hard to enforce that, but it's an option. They say, look, you can't own foreign securities, or you can't own XYZ, or if you have this much money, then these other rule set applies. They try to basically block the exits as much as possible, and then do that kind of deval. That's kind of the big risk that people face. I think that's going to be a lot harder now because now we have social media and now we have globally portable capital, things like Bitcoin, that allow people to move around more or communicate what's happening in real time more. And so it's hard to kind of do those things that rely on obfuscation. A lot of times in emerging markets, when you'll see ongoing currency weakness, they'll say, "Look, this is a result of speculators attacking our currency, and therefore we're going to do capital controls." And the reason it partially works is because there's usually a grain of truth to it. Usually it's because they've destabilized their money so much that, of course, now people are saying, "Hey, look, if you're going to hold interest rates below the inflation rate, I'm happy going to borrow some." And then they say, "No, that's a speculative attack on our currency." It's like, well, no, I was following the economics that you've built into the system, right? So weakness tends to result in more weakness and attacks on that weakness, which is just kind of naturally incentivized behavior. But I do think that's the era that we're going through, of various countries trying to devalue their debt relative to their nominal GDP, for example, to do it in such a way that it's not super obvious where possible. Try to do it gradually where possible, sometimes sharply if needed, and then to try to kind of add frictions, at least to certain exits, to make it non-trivial to short what they're doing and buy scarcer things. Even though I think that that's ultimately the solution, you have to be kind of careful with how you do it and maybe diversified in how you do it, because there are going to be pushbacks on people trying to benefit from the situation, or at least protect themselves from the situation.
In today's discussion, we delved into the evolving landscape of financial systems, from the analog era of bank runs to the digital age of fast transactions. Lyn Alden provided insights into the challenges faced by Bitcoin companies operating within the fiat currency system, highlighting the importance of understanding the dynamics of public and private debt cycles. As we navigate through these complexities, it's crucial to consider strategies for safeguarding investments, such as owning real assets and managing debts wisely. Remember, your feedback is invaluable to us, so don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments below.